enforce antitrust regulations on technology giants. Our sole contention is that enforcing antitrust law cripples the tech sector. The U.S. tech industry has been responsible for some of the greatest economic breakthroughs in modern history. Kennedy of IT and Innovation Foundation explains in 2018 that half of the top 10 global R&D spenders are big U.S. tech firms such as Amazon, Apple, and Google. Unfortunately, enforcing antitrust law cripples the industry, stopping quintessential contributions from being made. Affirming hurts these companies in two ways. First, is shifting the focus away from research. Senna Bloomberg writes that uncertainty created by antitrust scrutiny shifts the focus of companies from innovations to dividends and stock buybacks to insulate themselves from investor pressure. And this has happened before in countries that enforce antitrust law. Andrea O'Sullivan of Reason magazine in 2019 finds that Europe's antitrust fines over the past decade has significantly reduced levels of R&D spending, and their stringent policies are exactly why the European Union tech companies are not nearly as successful as those in America. Chappelle, the International Center for Law and Economic quantifies in 2018, European Union regulations represent on average 277% of what companies invest annually on R&D. Second is lowering total capital for companies. Because antitrust reduces the potential profitability of tech companies, investors worry and pull out of their investments. But the mayor of the University of Kansas did an empirical study of different antitrust cases and found that each case reduces investments by $1.7 billion. Unfortunately, Kennedy of IT and Innovation Foundation explains in 2018 that firms need to be able to obtain high profits in order to reinvest in innovation as both expensive and uncertain. Not from the Center of Economic Studies quantifies in 2016 that large firms conduct 6 times more R&D than small firms and have 13% higher productivity with that R&D. Having large tech companies in charge of innovation ensures long-term, sustainable research and development. There are 3 impacts. First is the U.S. economy. Volker from the Austrian Institute of Economic Research found in 2007, a 10% increase of share of R&D performed in the high-tech sector amounts to a 2.3% increase in long-term GDP per capita. This means that standard of living increases for everybody. Because of this, the International Trade Administration furthers in 2019 that software and information technology accounts for 10.5 million jobs. Second is ensuring the success of AI. According to AI expert Kai-Fu Lee in his 2018 book, AI Superpowers, the quantity of data becomes decisive in determining overall power and accuracy of an algorithm for artificial intelligence. Big tech is on track to apply this data to help those in need. Nancy Pugh of the Healthcare Weekly in 2019 writes that big 4 tech companies sees into the future of healthcare AI to transform medicine and have invested billions of dollars within it. An example of this is Google's Verily, which is using AI to streamline health insurance and predict early forms of disease diagnosis. Dr. Winnie Tang of the University of Hong Kong explains the impact. New surgeries and treatments from AI are expected to save 22,000 lives every single year by 2030. Finally, is spreading internet across the world. Kassir of the Public Sphere Journal in 2018 writes that breaking up big tech companies would have a decisive impact in the developing world, since big companies have long-term plans to spread internet and tech infrastructure to poorer countries. For instance, Facebook's ExpressWiFi.Internet.org program has given access to 100 million people that otherwise would not have had the internet. Google also developed a hotspot program which gave 1.5 million people access to internet in India. Unfortunately, Senna Bloomberg points out that antitrust pressures forces these companies to drop risky growth strategies like this. Technological development is so important because it creates avenues for growth, employment, education, and globalization. Heard of The Guardian explains in 2016 that internet access would raise 500 million people out of poverty, because you need big companies to do the biggest things in the game.
Can I see Europe led to, it's like 277% of R&D investment? Sure.
Start now. Okay. That was 2 seconds. Is anyone not ready? We affirm our sole contention is an innovation nation. Antonio Martinez of Wired 18 explains that the current tech titans have complete control over their separate industries, ensuring that big tech never has to compete among themselves. However, the growth in market share has come with the depth of innovation, as MIT 16 analyzes that big tech focuses its innovation spending on marginal changes on existing technologies, while tech startups focus on more radical innovation. The reasoning is simple. Kenneth Rogoff, 18 of MarketWatch, analyzes that big tech makes most of their money from their core products. Because of this, Simon 19 of Sustainable Development Studies furthers that monopolies have little incentive to innovate, opting to slow the pace of technological change. Overall, Jonathan Tepper, 18 of Bloomberg, finds that big tech expands through buying back their own stock artificially to inflate their own value and make money, even if they innovate. He furthers that big tech often fails to commercialize their products. For example, Xerox had the technology to develop the modern computer in the 70s, but became complacent and failed to develop. That's why Berger, 18 of MIT, finds that tech research productivity has gone down 6.8% every year. Luckily, enforcement of antitrust regulations would reverse this trend of wasted products in two key ways. The first is by ending acquisitions. Acquisitions are when one company buys another one to grow. Unfortunately, Vince Cable, 18 of The Guardian, analyzes that acquisitions allow big tech to destroy smaller companies before they can become a threat. Tepper clarifies that big tech has undergone over 500 acquisitions in the past decade, decreasing innovation. For example, he writes that in 2013, Google acquired Boston Dynamics as well as 8 other companies, shutting them down, causing their top researchers to leave. This is not an isolated incident, as Wu, 19 of the New York Times, writes that nearly half of Facebook's acquisitions have resulted in the acquired company being shut down. Kozonet of Cape Analytics, 18, furthers that over the past 5 years, 90% of all AI startups have been bought out by tech giants. Rather than bringing their products to market, big tech shelves the AI tech while moving researchers. For example, computer scientists who used to work on predicting natural disasters were repurposed to improve Facebook's facial recognition. Luckily, there is hope, as Hubbard finds that many of these deals are in violation of current antitrust law that were made to prevent such anti-competitive behavior. But the second is through releasing patents. Rurex finds in 2018 that Google currently holds more than 52,000 patents. Luckily, Day in 17 explains that antitrust enforcement on companies like Google would force them to make all of their patents available for public use. Historically, antitrust regulation against AT&T in 1956 freed nearly 8,000 patents, causing a significant increase in innovation. Dane concludes that this case laid the foundation for Silicon Valley and the internet, leading to the birth of a plethora of tech companies. Enforcing antitrust regulation against Google would force them to give up patents, creating another innovation boom. It's for these two reasons that Siegel of the National Bureau of Economic Research 05 concludes that more robust antitrust enforcement will boost innovation in all levels of the industry, increasing long-term consumer welfare. The impact of affirming is revitalizing innovation. Harvard 17 quantifies that R&D returns have dropped 65% over the past 30 years. They finalize that because innovation drives the productivity in our economy, the US economic growth rate will soon decline to 0% if nothing is done. Tech is key, as the International Telecommunications Union 18 explains that AI offers an unprecedented opportunity to eradicate hunger and global poverty by giving governments precise information about poverty concentration, allowing for highly efficient poverty alleviation efforts. NICE of the World Economic Forum 19 furthers that currently, governments lack the data to identify the poor and cannot target resources to them, condemning 300 million people to poverty. However, Kozonet finds that anti-competitive actions by tech giants will reduce the total impact of artificial intelligence by 95%. Ultimately, Pearson of the Max Planck Institute quantified that just 3-year use of antitrust enforcement will lead to an increase in GDP per capita by 2%. And the World Bank concludes that this increase would reduce poverty by 3.4%, saving millions. An uncontrolled market is a disease, but affirming with antitrust is the cure. Yeah.
First, that productivity in the tech sector is down by 6.8%. And second, that Facebook kills half of the companies it acquires.
No.
Which one's first?
Berger.
Thank you.
So yeah, we can open it up. There's just a graph above it showing.
Do you also have releasing patents increases innovation?
too, but I think I'm in cross.
There we go. Just let us know. Okay, so the problem we're having is that the New York Times has like a subscription cap where we can only pull up so many articles.
Let me try and do it on my computer.
We'll do it on his computer and we'll give it to you during cross, so we can just speed this up.
Okay, let's just get going.
Sorry about that, guys.
This is still a Facebook thing, right?
Yeah, it's the cut shuts down half their acquisitions. I promise you there's like nothing more than the chunk and the graph on top of it.
Great. Let's talk about your impacts. You say that AI can eradicate hunger because they can identify where poverty is concentrated, right?
So they can take 300 million people out of poverty by providing governments with better data as to
How
where
does
it's
that?
located.
Yeah, that's fine. But like they know where they are. How does that get food or like get them out of poverty?
Well, I would contest that. I don't know if they necessarily know where they are. They need to know exactly where it's most concentrated and what geographic locations they have to provide the most
Okay.
amount of support
No,
to.
so that's not my question, right? My question is how do you gain access to pulling these people out of poverty? Like what is the action that AI does?
The
that
AI
pulls them out of
development and
poverty?
new technology that we're going to see within the upcoming years of development is going to assist governments in eradicating that poverty.
Okay, so
But
what is
you've
the
asked two questions.
but what is the government going to do to pull them out of poverty? Like after you identify that they're there, like we all know they're there, right?
So a lot
How
of
do
their
you pull them
poverty
out of
programs right now are having a bunch of wasted funds.
Okay,
They're
can
like
you-
using it on like misrepresented areas,
Can
but
you
with
read
that data.
evidence about that then? Like before you gain access to that impact?
So this is just me just giving the warranting for it.
Okay, but do you have a card for it?
We tell you the data is allowed to get 300 million people out of poverty.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I
Could
mean,
I take a
we
question?
disagree, but you can have a question.
Okay, so you read evidence that by enforcing antitrust, it would lead companies to drop risky growth strategies.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what risky growth strategies they're going to be dropping. On spreading the internet, what's risky about it?
Spreading the internet, like it
I
could
thought you said
fail.
they've already spread it to 1 billion people.
They've spread it to 1 million people. We say Google have, and Facebook has in India, but to spread it to entire continents such
Wait,
as
India
Africa,
rejected Facebook's like
no,
internet program.
Then we can show you the evidence afterwards. But the argument is it's extremely risky to like engage in this kind of tech infrastructure project because if they don't accept it or if it does not work out, then
Wait,
it's
don't
a
they
failed
already have like the
investment.
infrastructure and they've been successful in doing it? If they've already been successful, why would it now be risky?
No, okay, like you have to build up the infrastructure, right? They don't just all have it set up already. Like for example,
How
like,
much infrastructure
Google
have they
is in
built so
Kenya
far?
right now. What?
How much infrastructure have they built so far?
Like some. They built infrastructure in Kenya right now that gave access to 200,000 more people in Africa.
So
like,
where is
access
Facebook
to
saying they're
internet.
going to spread? Like where are you stopping it from going?
Our argument is when you create more research and development, that makes them do it more efficiently in the rest of the
I thought
developing
they could
world.
already
And that's
do
what
it though. Is it a
can
lack
I
of
just finish
funding
my-
or a lack of research?
It's a lack of research and a lack of funding.
Then why
right?
does hurting their funding
Because
automatically
here's
just
why.
make them research?
Here's why. Because that allows them to allocate funds more efficiently to create that infrastructure, right? It costs too much right now to build that infrastructure. If we can do it more efficiently, we could
Okay.
get that
So
500
let's talk
million
about the
people
AI that they
out
needed to-
of poverty.
Right.
But you just had a question.
yeah.
I'm gonna ask you a question. On your first word about acquisitions, you say that big companies destroy small companies.
Yes.
Why?
Because they would rather have to not compete with other companies in their sector and just maintain
So
market dominance.
they'd rather acquire up the small company and just not do anything with it?
Yeah, like say for instance they start providing a cheaper product, because that innovation made it cheaper, they would be making less revenue. They would instead decide to have a
Oh, okay, so
more
the,
expensive
so the
product.
small company made it cheaper, right? So like they would buy up that tech from the
No,
small
I'm saying
company
this is
and
a
make their
potential. I'm not
product
saying
cheaper.
small companies are making it cheaper.
So can you give me an example of like a company that Facebook bought up for a like innovation and just killed off the
We
innovation?
can give you 39 of them. They're in our card. So now I have a
Just
question.
give me one. Okay.
Where do you take that? start off on the top of their case. Their only contention is innovation, very similar to ours. They start off by saying that there's no competition, but my opponents are ignoring competition on two different levels. First, big tech companies compete with one another. Apple is always trying to undercut companies like Google in vertically integrated research and development, things like AI. We are literally in a race to see who can develop artificial intelligence the first. They are competitive with one another. But secondly, my opponents are only looking at the United States. There is a global market of research and development. What Stringfellow of Wired explains in 2018 is that we are in a tech race with China for things like artificial intelligence, for things like the mapping technology that my opponents talk about. If you were to harm our tech companies, that wins the race to China and just magnifies all of their impacts about consolidation of tech industry being a lot worse. But then they go on to explain why big companies are harmful for innovation and slowing the pace of technological change. But this could not be further from the truth. They are not short-term. They are the only companies that have access to long-term research and development because they have the capital to absorb the risk of doing that. That's why no small company can spread internet to 2 whole continents or has the data to set up AI algorithms in the first place. This is backed by history. What Zoffer of the Stanford Law Review explains is that only 40 big companies are responsible for 36% of all breakthrough innovation in global history. And then, let's look at small companies like my opponents talk about. What Atkinson of Harvard University in his 2018 book says is only 15% of small companies actually want to develop some kind of breakthrough technology because they're so worried about staying alive, they don't want to innovate. They are the ones that are adding bells and whistles and slowing the pace of innovation. Big companies aren't. Then they go on to say that productivity is declining by 6.8%, but their evidence never attributes this to slow growth in tech companies. What it attributes to is other factors, like how we're cracking down on things like immigration that's hurting our human capital. We would say it's comparatively worse if you were to vote for my opponents, because now you don't have the productivity and the large research that these firms do to effectively allocate resources. Remember, our not evidence from case says big companies are 15% more productive than smaller companies. So if you value productivity, you're always voting for us. Let's get into their warrants. Their first warrant talks about ending acquisitions. They say big companies destroy smaller companies. Again, this could not be further from the truth. They do so many things to help them out. What the University of Central Florida finds is big tech companies invest billions in startups, provide easy access to marketing and job training programs to help them start up and be competitive. But secondly, acquisitions aren't a bad thing. They are a good thing for the research and development process and small companies. What Hoffman of the FTC explains is that it allows venture capitalists to feel secure investing in a startup company in the first place because they feel secure knowing that they can get bought out by a large company like Facebook. That's why Forbes explains in 2018 that startups are up by 47% right now. If it's not broken, don't try and fix it. Then they read this evidence that Facebook kills off half of the companies they acquire. So many problems with this. First, it's just looking at 2 years, 2014 and 2011. Secondly, it continues to say how Facebook acquired things like Instagram and WhatsApp, but those are still being streamlined and they're being made better for consumers on top of that. Let's go to their second warrant that talks about releasing patents. They say that antitrust can allow them to create patents and that's good for innovation. First off, if a company has to release its property rights, that is huge amounts of revenue that these companies could lose out on. This feeds back into our narrative. When you have litigation and enforced antitrust law, it takes away the large capital these companies can use in investing in research and development. The bidding mayor evidence says per each litigation, they lose $1.7 billion. But secondly, this argument just isn't probable in the first place. The FTC's own chairman explained that the government would not pursue a path to ending patent law because they feel it's a violation of property rights. But on top of that, companies of the patents that they can release are already doing them right now. What Lardona of TechCrunch explains is that companies do this to spur innovation. For example, Microsoft already released 60,000 of its patents to spur innovation, but they do it so they can also research themselves. Don't break a system that is responsible for things like spreading the internet to 2 continents and helping artificial intelligence development. That's why we're proud to negate.
I'm going to go down their case and then I'm going to go to my case and talk on the truth. It'll take like 2 seconds. That's 1 second. I'm going to frontline first, then I'll go down their case. Okay. Jackson ready?
Yeah.
Opponents ready?
Yes.
Most importantly, judge ready. start at the top of my case. One, he tells you that these companies compete with each other, but he drops Martinez evidence that while they may be entering the same sectors, they don't interact with each other and the consumers that they actually go for. Like Microsoft and Apple both have phones, but they go for different sets of consumers. That's why they never have to compete with each other. Then he tells you that they have to compete in the global market, but this doesn't really make sense. They're going to compete in the global market either way, meaning he's just non-unique this third impact. Second, he tells you that they're the only people of the capital to focus on the long term. Turn that argument against them. What MIT explains is that the only reason that small businesses don't have the capital right now is because venture capitalists are not going to small businesses because they fear competing against the anti-competitive practices of big tech companies, meaning government reassurance or actual government action turns that argument against them. Then he tells you that our merger evidence doesn't actually look at like the decrease in innovation due to consolidation, while he drops the Harvard evidence that there's been a 65% decrease in innovation, and that's correlated with a 65% decrease in the US economic growth rate, and that's because of bad practices. Then, on our first link, he tells you that big tech is good. Like, combine all those responses that big tech is good. He drops the Roosevelt evidence, which is that 90% of all mergers and acquisitions in the AI sector shut down the small companies. His evidence is on general tech industries. Our impact's talking about AI. Then go to patents, bias, dealing, don't give him access to terms. At the top of his case, one, he tells you big tech is the most amount of people is spending the most amount of R&D. But the issue is, Roosevelt finds that the R&D spending that they're doing right now is focusing on their existing products. They're making the iPhone better. When Facebook bought out AI companies, they moved their researchers away from locating things like natural disasters and moved them to Facebook's AI like face recognition system. And that's why Temporary T finds that it's actually cheaper for big tech to focus on incremental innovations, but MIT analyzes that startups have to focus on radical innovation because that's the only way that they enter the market. And then on their first link, they tell you that they switch to things like stock buybacks. 4 responses. 1, they're literally already doing this right now. They don't have uniqueness. Second, and most importantly, if companies have decreased capital, that increases their incentive to innovate because they need to find another way to make money because clearly stock buybacks are not working right now. Third, if you have a decreased profit, you have an increased incentive to make more profit in the future, and that's not going to lead to things like stock buybacks. That's going to lead to things like other forms of development, which is going to end things like mergers and acquisitions because that's incredibly expensive. But then fourth and most importantly, the impacts are not risky. Remember what Jackson told you across. Their impacts are all empirical, showing that these investments are not risky because they're clearly working right now. Then they tell you that in Europe led to a decrease in R&D spending. One, Southeast 19 finds that in the EU they kept finding these companies, that's true, but their stock value kept rising, overvaluating any one of those finds. They find that because the EU has been investing in antitrust for so long, investors don't even bat an eye at it anymore. And then on their evidence that it's 277% of what they invest in R&D. One, the 277% statistic is talking about smaller companies. He explains that for companies valued over $1 billion, it's only 21.7% of their R&D spending. But second and most importantly, this does not matter because their evidence doesn't actually conclude it led to a decrease in innovation. Then on their second warn about a decrease in capital. One, this concedes the argument that they stop anti-competitive practices because if investors get scared, then these are not going to do is literally get it in charge, meaning their impacts short-term and triggers long-term impacts for us, meaning we buy all their offense without triggering any disas. Second and most importantly, Day 19 finds that the basis on IBM and Microsoft may have paralyzed those companies, but it led to smaller companies rising, and that's why we saw an increase in innovation. Third and most importantly, investors are not the same thing as revenue. They tell you decreased revenue leads to a decrease in expansion, but investors are not revenue. MarketWatch finds that last year Google had $48 billion worth of revenue. They can show you that that's what's actually cut. Fourth and most importantly, they say that there's a 6 times increase in R&D. That assumes actual commercialization. We tell you that it doesn't matter how much they innovate, they never commercialize the products because they don't have a need to. Then, on their impacts, on the first impact about economic growth, like crossed by the Harvard evidence, our economic growth is going down right now because of a dying in innovation. On their second link about AI, they drop the fact that big tech anti-competitive mergers and acquisitions and other anti-competitive practices are decreasing the effect of AI by 95% of long term because they're shelving products instead of commercializing them. And then on the third impact about AI, or about the internet, one, their first piece of evidence says that it says that breaking up big tech will lead to these impacts. Nobody's arguing about breaking up big tech, you shot them there. But second and most importantly, turn the argument against them. Because Wire 13 explains that the reason companies like Amazon are going into the developing world is to diversify their products. If companies' investment gets hurt, the safest thing to do is to diversify your products so they're going to enter more importantly. But then turn the argument against them again. If companies are hurt in the United States, that incentivizes their products incentivizes them to leave the United States, which means we co-op all their offense and turn it against them because that impact outweighs their entire first 2 impacts on scope, meaning at the end of the day, it's super clear for the affirmative.
What's the last response?
If companies are hurt in the U.S., increases their incentive to go where they aren't hurt, which is the developing world.
Okay. Ready for cross?
Yeah.
I would like to ask you about that last response. Is your argument that United States tech companies are going to offshore to Ghana?
Right, yeah. Why wouldn't they?
There's no infrastructure there for them to build. Like, you can't
Don't you
say
tell me they're building internet infrastructure?
internet access, yeah, but Google Loon is like a project that provides broadband from Loon. You tell me you have a piece of evidence that says that big tech companies are going to offshore to developing countries and set up their research industries.
No, I'm saying it's pretty logical, and that's why I came up with the response pretty quickly, right?
I don't
I'd argue the
think it's
reason
logical
innovation
at all.
went down in the EU is that they probably came over to the United States.
A developed
If the US
country.
does it, yeah, exactly. If the US does it, where are they going to go now? Back to the EU? No. They're definitely not going to China.
So
you're
how
telling me
long
these
do you think it's
companies are
going to
just
take
gonna
for them?
sit still and
How
do
long do you
nothing?
think it's going to take for them to offshore to a poorer country?
I don't know. I mean, you're telling me they're doing it right now, so probably not that long.
a while, right? Like we've enforced antitrust law on U.S. companies before, and they did not transport in the United States. Like
Well,
out
no,
of the United
because
States.
the only time we've had a big antitrust case was with Microsoft, but the Department of
We've had
Justice.
several more antitrust
No, but
cases.
what happened is that the Bush administration reshuffled the Department of Justice and made enforcement impossible. That's why no action actually happened.
AT&T
Do you mind if I take a no?
Sure,
What happened
sure.
in the AT&T case was a settlement after an 8-year court case. AT&T made the conscious
A
decision to
settlement that
break
broke
up.
them up into 8 different companies.
Yes, but that's
sure.
not ruling against them. Do you mind if I take your question?
Sure.
Okay, so why can't companies, if let's buy the argument that the revenue was hurt, why
Yeah.
can't they just move more revenue over to the R&D budget?
Because it's so risky and they lose money that way.
Wait,
Like,
but don't
you
they focus
can't
on
you can't just
long-term
say, okay,
investment?
they're gonna put all of their money and gamble it more on long-term investment. They only have long-term investment if they have the capital supply and the
You tell me that
resources
big
they
tech
know they
invests
have.
in startups, right?
Yeah,
That's a risky investment, right? 'Cause
Yes,
you
and they're
also
doing
read
it
that
right
they
now.
failed,
That's
right?
just furthering my argument.
Yeah, but if your argument is that when profit goes down, they want to become safer, right?
Yes.
If these are profit-driven companies, wouldn't they do what makes them the most
No,
profit in either
because
world?
it's a risk-reward basis. So maybe it will make them a lot of money, but it's very risky because it goes down. That's our entire argument.
Wait,
we need to
isn't
make sure
the
that
risk
big
of
tech
expanding into
companies
the developing
are
world the
large
same
and
in
have
either
economies
world?
of scale so
Wait,
that they
if
can
the
invest
United
in long-term
States
development.
enforces antitrust, how does that make investment into Ghana more risky?
Because it
Ghana's
hurts the
infrastructure
companies.
hasn't
That's our
changed,
argument.
their law
So
hasn't
do we
changed. I'm a
agree
little
that
confused.
enforcing antitrust law is probably going to hurt big tech companies' revenues?
I mean, like, tiny amount. These are
Tiny amount.
multi-trillion-dollar companies.
Yes, I understand, but
Yeah.
it's going to be a significant portion. Like, let's look at past precedent, right? In the
Yeah.
EU, big companies took a big hit.
No, they didn't.
Yes, they did.
The largest fine that ever occurred in the EU was $5.1 billion.
Yeah.
Google made $48 billion in
We say
revenue last
each
year.
case in the United
$1.2
States is
trillion.
$1.7 billion. So you're saying that the affirmative advocacy gets to dance around the question of the resolution and say we can have small companies and big tech companies. Big tech companies won't be hurt, but we'll still have smaller
Well,
companies.
no, I'd argue big tech may be hurt, but at least their incentive to innovate goes up. They don't innovate if there's no one else in the market.
Innovation
even
is
if there's
too
a
risky. Like, that's
If
our
innovation
whole
was too
point.
risky, they would not be doing it right now. Here's the difference.
No,
Alvin,
because
let me
they-
make it
they
very
can
simple.
absorb risk
Your
right now.
case only impacts out to the cost of innovation. It does not impact out to the risk. That means the risk exists in either world, and you're either dealing with your case or non-unique.
My case
But
is
that's
all
cross.
about the risk.
Can I see a response that they're going from different countries?
There was an end of it.
Okay.
It's diversifying products.
Oh, yeah, I can show you why, like, everyone's doing that right now.
Okay, that's a good way to do that. Let's start.
All the judges ready? We're gonna talk about AI and small businesses on their arguments first, and then we're gonna come back to big tech on my case. Does that make sense? All right. Let's start on their case. They say that 90% of AI is just killed off. That's not true. Large companies buy up smaller firms in order to streamline their products. Here's why you prefer this forward. We tell you AI can only be developed by big tech firms because neural networks need a large amount of data in order to learn. The only way you have a large amount of data is by consolidating that data within big firms. Google is the only one that can collect that data. But secondly, the Hoffman evidence, which they cold drop, don't let them respond to it in second summary, tells you that venture capitalists actually benefit from larger firms. Here's why. Larger firms have far more security in their stock. As a venture capitalist, I would rather be attached to a company that is attached to Facebook because Facebook stock is always stable. This is why the Forbes evidence indicates that startups have increased by 47% because there's so much stability within the big tech industry. But let's look to our arguments. Even if you buy all of their arguments, we're still going to outweigh here because it's all about innovation. So let's look at who innovates the best. A, not from the center of law and economics explains that large firms have 6 times more on-net innovation and are 13% more efficient with that innovation. So you want efficiency here as well. But B, Harvard University's Robert Atkinson explains the best kind of innovation comes from big tech firms because only 15% of the time do small tech firms make proprietary technology, which means the majority of the time they're adding bells and whistles to existing technology, making the iPhone 10 to the iPhone 11. Do not vote here. But secondly and thirdly and most importantly is scale. Scale matters most here because only Apple can create 1 billion new iPhones. A small company cannot do that and redistribute all those phones. So let's look at how we get there. On our second warrant, they say you disincentivize investment right now, but no, you need more R&D and more investment in order to create this kind of R&D, because we say without the kind of money, you will lose R&D first because it's such a risky investment. But secondly, they say Google still has a lot of revenue. However, R&D gets cut out first. You look to historical precedents. When Microsoft got sued with antitrust, they cut out all their touchscreen innovation, which is why they lost the mobile phone race. But finally, they say they don't commercialize the product. No, we tell you that commercializing the internet in the status quo right now, 1 million people now have access in India on the impact level. They say you don't break them up. That's not true. They already lose revenue, which means they break up. Then they say you diversify products. No, the internet is the most risky growth strategy, which is why it's not a diversification for more safety kind of strategy, which means 500 million people get access to the internet, and you should vote there.
The room for
our case on ending acquisitions, and then their case. Okay. Is anyone not ready?
Oh, can I ask real quick? Can you just set the alarm on your phone to go off?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because if we're gonna go over time, I need to know when to stop.
Most definitely. Okay. Time will start now. Starting at the top of our case, in which we tell you that big tech primarily profits from their core products. That means they don't actually have an incentive to innovate. Then we tell you that means they don't commercialize new products. The only response they make on their case is that they are commercializing them. They're spreading internet to India. That's not new technology. What we tell you is the new development of technology is not being spread to the consumer. That's why big tech is not utilizing 95% of AI. That's our impact on 300 million people being taken out of poverty. They clean can see this in summary. We get perfect access. With that, let's go on our first warrant. They say big tech's better at innovating. That doesn't matter at the point in which they don't commercialize that new innovation. At that point, you're going to be prioritizing small businesses, A, because they increase competition, but B, because they force new innovation to come to the market, something big tech can't do. Remember, we tell you, by enforcing antitrust legislation, we stop big tech from being able to do anti-competitive mergers in which Facebook buys a bunch of companies and just shuts them down immediately. Okay, yeah. So then go on to their case. They drop a lot of stuff. First, on their impact about how much fines reduce R&D, they drop the fact that this is talking about smaller businesses. When looking at big businesses, it actually decreases R&D by 21.7%. They say they cut from R&D first, but this makes no intuitive sense. Research and development makes them money by innovating. This makes them long-term business strategies. They say it's going to be risky inherently. If it was that risky, they wouldn't be doing it in the first place. They dropped the Harvard evidence, which explains that big tech innovation right now is going down in the status quo. The only side that has risk at increasing that, even if they are better at innovating, is the affirmation. Additionally, they dropped the response that we read on the bottom on the impact on spreading the internet, in which companies like Amazon are trying to diversify their markets or diversify their products by going to other markets. The side that stops that is the negation. And then they drop the fact that when we enforce antitrust and we start to apply economic pressure on them, we incentivize them to go to other places that aren't the United States. If they're talking about internet expansion, that's going to be actually helping the developing world. Anything else? Okay, Rich on.
You got off the first question.
So let's talk about the sort of like AP, whatever you guys do in summary. You guys say that there's not going to be any newer innovation from large firms, right?
Well, there's going to be newer innovation, but it's just on their existing products.
Okay, why is that?
Because they make the vast majority of their profit from it.
But
The iPhone,
Okay, so,
Google search
like,
engine,
do you
ad
think
that's
revenues.
like they're gonna invest like their capital on something that is already making them money or something that has the potential to make them money.
What's already making the money right now.
Wait, let's try this. Who do you think can absorb more risk, right? Like Google created the Google Glasses, which was a failing product, and then they're still fine.
We
Can a
don't
small
con- we don't
can I
contest
finish my-
any of that.
wait. Can a small startup do the same thing with an idea,
No, guys.
fail, and still be in business?
The analysis Jackson made is that it increases the competition and forces big tech to innovate. We are not saying that small.
So small businesses
Wait.
failing creates
No,
competition.
guys, you want me to answer it?
Yeah, sure.
We are not saying that small businesses are going to be the ones going to the developing world. We're saying big tech is not innovating on AI. If startups cannot be acquired, and this is what Jackson says, it increases competition and forces big tech to commercialize 95% of AI
That's
products.
just not true. Who are the leaders in AI development and investment?
Right now, big tech, because they're buying out the small companies
Exactly.
and not utilizing their
Okay.
profit.
Wait, wait,
Or
are you-
investing in
guys,
Project Verify,
guys.
which is a healthcare artificial intelligence technology.
Okay, well, that
But
was
the-
the
but the-
example in summary.
in summary.
Hold on,
Like,
hold
we
on.
didn't accept a
Guys, but
single number.
the warrant you guys don't really interact with is the one about data, right? Like, how do neural networks work? How does AI work?
I'm aware of what you're gonna say. Like I'm gonna say
Okay,
like, oh,
so
they
can you
need
just answer
data
my
in order to
question?
develop, right? They need data
No,
in
but-
order
but-
to train AI,
right.
right?
Like,
We
for
are not
example-
saying small
for
companies
example.
use AI in the
Example.
developing world. We're saying as long as the small company has the ability to develop AI in any way or the threat to, it forces big tech to innovate on the patents
The
they have.
problem is
That's why we co-op all the
guys,
offense on your
The
teams.
problem is that artificial intelligence is like an infant until you teach it how to self-learn, right? Like only with Google search programs and all of their search data
And the time
do they
we-
create an artificial intelligence that actually works.
And we
So my
start
question,
teaching the
so,
AI to learn,
so
in
my
which
question
they're
here,
in which they have
guys,
competition. Yeah.
so my question here is how does a small business acquire that level of data to make their AI the same level as Google's?
Well, they're
We are
doing
not
it right
saying-
now,
I mean-
given that fact that like Google is
They're
buying
doing it right
small.
now.
or-
Who's doing it right
But
now?
if they weren't able to
It's
do
not
it, why
just
would
Google's
Google buy them
buyer.
out?
Wait, what?
If they couldn't do it, why would Google buy them out?
Okay, so here's what happens, right? Like small business creates a neural network to begin with, like which is like an infant, right? Google takes that infant and teaches them how to walk.
Okay.
Like that's literally what happens by
we are
feeding it
not
data.
If you were to hurt mergers and acquisitions, that stops the streamlining process.
There's a really big problem
so-
here.
so
we
the
are not
analysis-
contesting that big tech is better than small tech. We are saying
Okay.
all of your responses are in the capability of big tech. We're
Great.
saying they're not utilizing that capability.
Okay.
If you increase competition,
Okay.
big tech utilizes that capability. We co-op every
But
piece
they
of
saying
our
we're
investment.
saying we're not
Wait, really
commercializing
quickly,
those
they
two
work
products.
best when they're together, right? Like
No.
even if smaller companies
They can work
incentivize
best, but
larger
they
ones,
don't.
if smaller companies have the patent on like a healthcare AI product and it can't be acquired and funded by a big
At the
company,
end of the
then
day,
it's an
you guys
FDI.
drop in summary that they use mergers and acquisitions to shut down 90% of AI startups.
We're gonna take our last 20 seconds. I'll set my alarm too. Alright. Is everybody ready? Okay. This debate has come down to two issues. small companies and big companies. I'm going to explain to you why we win for both of these companies. First, on smaller ones, which is how my opponents access every single one of their arguments. They did not respond to what I've been saying since rebuttal. The mergers and acquisition system helps small companies. We say that there attracts venture capitalism, because if I'm a venture capitalist, I'd rather invest in a company that will get bought up, so I have stake in Facebook. This is more secure. Weigh this against their analysis of a company killing them off on probability, because you need a venture capitalist in a small business before it even starts up in a first place. That's a prerequisite. But also, companies want to bring their products to market. That's what Google is doing with AI. They're not shelving it, they're not canceling it, they're using it as a long-term growth strategy. But the other way you weigh this argument is because it's happening right now. The Forbes evidence says that startups are up by 47%. They have never responded to this evidence once in today's round. Don't let them do it in Final Focus. Insofar as this is the only path to the ballot they have, it's already game over and you should be voting for us. But the other way you vote for us is on big tech companies and bigger tech companies having long-term projects. The only thing they say is that big tech companies aren't good at innovating and the smaller companies can drive them to do that. They don't win small companies, so they don't win that. But on top of that, if big tech companies cannot merge with the smaller ones, there's no way for them to streamline their product. If they don't have the capital and they don't have the resources to invest in long-term growth strategies, they don't do them. That's where the shifting focus argument comes from, and that's what gives us our impacts on internet and artificial intelligence. They just say that Amazon is going to diversify products and they're going to move to developing countries. That is exactly a long-term risky growth strategy. That goes away when you hurt big tech companies' profits in the first place, but also it just doesn't make a lot of sense for them to move over to another poor country. That's going to take such a long time. Look for what you know is happening right now. You know that 100 million people are already getting internet access for free. That's operating at a loss, and if you charge them, it won't happen. But also on artificial intelligence. Big tech companies are a prerequisite because you need large amounts of data in the first place.
I'm going to go to their case, and then I'm going to go back over to my case. You guys ready? Factions ready? Judges ready? On their case, they lose it. It's pretty simple. I'll be listening to extend a link in Final Focus. You don't know if he's going for his first link or his second link. Let's attack both. On his first link, he drops it. It's only 21.7% of R&D spending. Clearly, they're going to focus on what makes them the most money, which means all his weighing about how his impact is really big delinks it because it shows that they're always going to go to it. This is what we've been talking about all around. R&D makes some money. It's what Jackson extended in summary, and they never responded to. And then on their second link, he also drops the fact that they have high amounts of revenue, and they have the ability to invest in either world, and that a decrease in capital incentivizes their innovate to continuously innovate in the long term because they know they need to make money. How we didn't address any of that in Final Focus. Either way, let's go to his impact. Not only were all of his responses to our turns over time in summary, but the ones that I extended in Final Focus were brand new in Final Focus. But let's address them anyways. He says that it's a long-term investment, so it goes away. Doesn't matter. He never interacts with the warrant that we make, which is that when when companies lose money, they want to play safe. The best way to play safe is to diversify your products. This was never interacted with. This was in rebuttal. It was dropped in summary and was poorly addressed in Final Focus. But second and most importantly, he says it makes no sense, but that doesn't matter. That doesn't interact with the warrant of when you hurt a big tech company in the United States that incentivizes their innovation, that incentivizes them to move over to the offshore areas, and that increases internet access. On that, let's go over to our case. The one thing he extends in Final Focus is that he's a prerequisite to small businesses. That does not matter. We are not saying small businesses innovate. We are not saying small businesses commercialize, and we are not saying small businesses are going to use that technology. The warrant that Jackson extends very clearly is that if big companies can merge and acquire with small businesses, they do not compete with them. That means that they do not commercialize any of the products that they have. They use AI to increase their existing products, and that's why 95% of the social and economic impact of AI is being limited by anti-competitive behavior. But when you do not allow them to merge, it doesn't matter if the amount of startups goes down. Startups at least compete with big tech instead of working with big tech that forces commercialization of products. That is how you pull 300 million people out of poverty, which one, always their case on strength of blame, because this entire warrant never goes contested. But second, it's a prerequisite to their argument, because if 300 million people are in poverty, they're definitely not getting iPhones, they're definitely not going on Facebook, and they're definitely not getting access to internet. At the end of the day, we win every link into every impact, and you're affirming today.